I had always been invisible. To my parents, I was a shadow, a barely noticeable presence in their chaotic, ever-shifting lives. When they divorced, it wasn't about me. I was just left behind. My mother moved halfway across the country with her new boyfriend, barely sparing me a glance. My father stayed in the house, sinking deeper into his loneliness. His bitterness toward my mother making him forget I existed at all. I didn't have a breakdown. I didn't cry. I wasn't the type. I simply packed my things and walked out of their lives as they had walked out of mine, like a character in a book who quietly disappears, never to be remembered. I went to live with Aunt Linda, my mother's younger sister, who had no children of her own. She had a chain-smoker's laugh that always seemed a bit too loud and too desperate, like she was trying to convince herself that she was okay. Maybe she was, but I was far from it. I hated that house, hated the smell of stale cigarettes and burnt coffee that clung to everything. In time, I learned to survive. I finished high school by working 2 jobs, one in a diner, the other cleaning office buildings after hours. The money wasn't great, but I never cared. I'd learned to take care of myself a long time ago. When it came time for college, I didn't ask for help. I didn't need to. I had a scholarship, a few loans, and a plan to escape this life. Then came the letter. It arrived one rainy Thursday morning, tucked into my mailbox like an unwanted bill. The envelope was thick and heavy, and the address printed on it, Henry Calloway Esq., sent a chill down my spine. I hadn't heard from him in years. Henry Calloway was my grandfather, the one person who, for reasons I never quite understood, seemed to hate me the most. He had never been the affectionate type, cold, distant, demanding. I remember the one time I saw him, at a family gathering when I was little. He'd looked at me once, barely, before turning away. That was the extent of our connection. I wasn't surprised when I found out he had cut ties with the family after some financial scandal. People whispered about him, about shady deals and gambling debts, but it was all vague rumors. I tore open the envelope, my heart pounding, expecting a death notice. What I found instead was a letter. Dear Emma Calloway, we regret to inform you of the passing of your grandfather, Henry Calloway. As per his will, we are pleased to inform you that you have been named the sole heir of his estate. Please find attached details regarding your inheritance, including Calloway House in Boston. We request your presence to formally accept the inheritance and review the terms outlined in the will. Sincerely, Attorney Claire Dawson. I reread the letter 3 times, my mind struggling to process it. My grandfather had left me a house, and not just any house. A massive, crumbling mansion on the outskirts of Boston, a place so old that the mere thought of it made my skin crawl. People called it Calloway House, but it was really more like Calloway Castle, with its broken windows, decaying stone walls, and overgrown ivy that strangled it like a dead hand. I didn't want the house. I didn't even want to be tied to that name anymore. But then I saw the amount he'd left me. $1 million, hidden behind a few lines of legalese. For a moment, I considered just walking away, forgetting about the past, about the house, and about him. But then I thought about Aunt Linda's laugh, the years of feeling abandoned, of being a ghost in my own life. I thought about my mother, who had never looked back when she left me behind, and my father, who had always been too wrapped up in his bitterness to see me. $1 million, 1 million, could change everything. I made up my mind. I would go. I would claim what was mine, and for once I would take control. The drive to Boston felt long, like the miles between me and that house were somehow stretching out, pulling me into a past I wasn't sure I wanted to face. When I arrived, it was already dark, and the house stood at the end of a long, twisted driveway, its silhouette a dark shadow against the moonlit sky. Calloway House was even more imposing up close. Towering stone walls, windows like eyes staring out into nothing, and a massive iron door that looked as though it hadn't been opened in decades. The wind howled through the branches of the trees, shaking the old house as though it was alive, breathing. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Some part of me had hoped it would be a dream, a mistake, a mix-up in the legal system, but this was real. The house was mine, and the past was waiting inside, tucked in its forgotten corners. I pushed the door open with a creak that echoed through the empty halls. The air inside was thick with dust and stale air. It smelled old, like time itself had decided to settle here and never leave. I stepped into the parlor. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the chandelier overhead swayed with an eerie creak. It looked like a house trapped in time, frozen in some distant memory of the past. The only sound was my footsteps echoing through the vast emptiness. And then, I heard something. A door closing. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. I had entered the house alone. There was no one else here. I turned, my heart racing. But when I looked, all I saw was the empty hallway stretching before me. Nothing. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, a draft through the old walls. But the house felt too still, too quiet. I took a deep breath and pushed forward. The sooner I went through the motions, the sooner I could leave. The papers needed to be signed, the will read. I didn't have to stay here forever. Then I heard it again. A whisper. I froze. "Emma," came from behind me. A soft, barely audible sound. Like the wind had taken form and decided to speak. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. But there was nothing. Just the cold, dark hallway stretching endlessly ahead of me. I wasn't alone. But I was beginning to realize I hadn't been alone in this house for a very long time. I had inherited more than a mansion. I had inherited a curse. The next morning, I met with the lawyer, Claire Dawson, in a small, sterile office near the edge of town. She was professional, distant, but I could see something in her eyes. She wasn't just an attorney. She was someone who had lived through this, someone who had seen the house and all its secrets. She handed me the will, the documents, and explained the stipulations. "You have to stay in the house for a year," she said, her tone flat. "Otherwise, you forfeit the inheritance." A year. I had no choice. But something in the back of my mind told me that the house was more than just a mansion. It was a trap. The lawyer hesitated before speaking again, almost as if she were trying to gauge my reaction. "There are things here," she said quietly. "You'll need to be careful." Careful. I wasn't sure what she meant, but I was beginning to get the feeling that I was already too deep in. As I left her office, the weight of the decision hit me all at once. A year in that house. Could I survive it? Would I? The drive back to Calloway House felt like the first step into a nightmare. And yet, as I pulled up to the mansion, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of inevitability. It was mine, and it had been waiting for me. The wind howled louder as I approached the house, pushing through the rusted gates. The iron creaked under the pressure, as if protesting my return. I felt something shift in the air, an unexplainable weight, as if the house itself knew I was back and was already sizing me up. I parked the car and stared at the mansion for a moment, its towering silhouette looming against the moonlit sky. The windows were like dark, hollow eyes watching me, judging me. I had thought the night before was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. But now, standing in front of the house again, the sense of unease was growing. Something was wrong here, something far beyond the ordinary. I took a deep breath, gripped the door handle, and forced myself to step out of the car. I had a year to make this place mine, to figure out why my grandfather had left it to me, why he had left me. I wasn't going to let fear take over. I had spent my entire life being abandoned, overlooked, treated like I didn't matter. This time I would not run. As I approached the front door, it creaked open on its own, the sound sharp and unnerving. The house seemed to be waiting for me, its silence almost expectant. I stepped inside, feeling an almost tangible tension in the air, like a dozen eyes were upon me, even though I knew the place was empty. The foyer was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the cracked windows. The wallpaper peeled off the walls in long, curling strips, exposing the old wood underneath. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped further into the house, my footsteps echoing unervingly in the hollow emptiness. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. The house felt alive in a way that was unsettling, like it wasn't just a building, but a presence, a weight, pushing in from every corner. I walked down the long hallway, my hand brushing against the walls as I passed. The air was thick with dust, but the more I moved through the house, the colder it became. A sharp chill that had nothing to do with the outside weather crept over my skin. The parlor was just as I remembered it from the night before. Furniture covered in white sheets, old and abandoned. But now there was something else in the air. A faint scent, not entirely unpleasant, but not welcoming either. A mix of old wood, decay, and something floral, like dried roses. I wasn't sure where it was coming from, but it seemed to be drifting from the direction of the staircase. I made my way to the stairs, heart thudding loudly in my chest. The banister was slick under my fingers, coated with a layer of dust so thick it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. As I climbed, the house creaked and groaned around me, its old bones protesting underfoot. There was something so eerie about the silence, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. When I reached the second floor, I found more of the same. Rooms lined with furniture covered in dust sheets, forgotten and frozen in time. There was a small library at the end of the hall, the door ajar. I stepped inside, feeling a strange pull. It wasn't the books that intrigued me. It was the quiet sense of history that seemed to seep from the walls. I moved slowly between the rows of bookshelves, running my fingers along the spines, tracing the names and dates. Most of the books looked old, worn, and forgotten, but one in particular caught my eye. It wasn't on a shelf. It was tucked into a corner, resting on an old armchair, as if it had been abandoned hastily. I picked it up, a sense of dread creeping up my spine as I opened the cover. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age, but the handwriting inside was clear. The Calloway Covenant, A Legacy of Blood. The title was scrawled in elegant script. Beneath it, there were more notes, disturbing notes, written in my grandfather's unmistakable hand. This house is not just a place. It is a pact, a debt passed down through the generations. One must pay what is owed, or the curse will claim you. I felt a chill spread through my body as I read. Was this why my grandfather had left me the house? Why had he been so secretive? The words in this book were not the ramblings of a man who had been losing his mind. They were the words of someone trapped, desperate to escape something far older and more dangerous than I could imagine. I flipped through the pages, but the further I read, the more disturbing the content became. Stories of past Calloway generations who had tried to break the family curse, only to fall victim to its wrath. Each attempt was met with failure, and each failed attempt was followed by a strange death. Some had died in fire, others in drownings, some in accidents so bizarre that they couldn't have been coincidental. I slammed the book shut, my breath ragged. This wasn't just about an inheritance. It was about something far more sinister, something that had been buried for generations, but had never truly been gone. As I turned to leave the room, the air grew colder. My breath fogged in front of me. I froze, my heart racing. There, in the doorway, was the shadow of a figure. I couldn't see its face, only a silhouette, a dark, indistinct shape standing completely still. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against me from all sides. I should have run, but instead, I stood there, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice was low, distorted, like it was coming from far away, or from deep beneath the house. It didn't belong to any living person, and yet it sounded like someone I should know, someone I had known, maybe even forgotten. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. The shadow didn't move, but it was as if it were waiting for me to respond. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, before the figure disappeared into the wall. No sound, no footsteps, just the emptiness left in its wake. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out of this place, I realized. The inheritance, the house, the contract, all of it felt like a mistake. A dangerous, deadly mistake. But before I could turn and run, something stopped me. A flash of light, a flicker in the corner of my eye. A faint glow was seeping through the cracks of the walls. Something was stirring in the house. Something was waking up. I had inherited more than just a mansion. I had inherited a legacy of blood, of death, of promises made long before I was born. And the house would not let me leave without paying the price. The air in Calloway House was thick with menace. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark awareness, breathing in my fear and feeding on it. After seeing the shadowy figure in the library, I knew leaving wasn't an option. Not yet. Whatever haunted this place wasn't done with me. It wanted something. I couldn't shake the memory of its voice. Low, distorted, and vaguely familiar. You shouldn't have come back. The words echoed in my head like a curse. Determined to understand what I was dealing with, I took the old leather-bound journal from the library and headed upstairs, my fingers still trembling. I locked the door to what used to be the master bedroom, my bedroom now, though I doubted a lock would keep anything out in this cursed house. I lit the old oil lamp on the nightstand and sat cross-legged on the creaky bed, spreading the journal and the strange contract across the quilt. The Calloway Covenant, a legacy of blood. I flipped back to the pages describing the family's dark pact, reading carefully this time. The terms were worse than I'd imagined. An ancient debt paid with blood. Each generation was bound by the original deal my ancestors had made. Power and wealth in exchange for life. Those who tried to run were hunted down, claimed by something old, something relentless. One entry in particular caught my attention. The firstborn must pay, or the debt will consume the next of kin. The house remembers what is owed. My stomach twisted as the pieces began to click into place. My grandfather had never tried to break the pact. He'd avoided it. He wasn't the firstborn. He must have passed the debt down to my mother. And when she abandoned me, the curse must have followed the bloodline straight to me. I slammed the book shut, feeling sick. My whole life I'd believed my parents had left because they didn't care. But now I understood. They'd left because they were terrified. Before I could process any more, the oil lamp flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the room. A cold wind swept through, extinguishing the flame entirely, plunging me into darkness. The house groaned, as though shifting its weight. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the staircase. I scrambled to my feet, heart pounding. The door rattled once, then fell still. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a soft, familiar voice called out from the other side. "Emma, it's me. Open the door." My breath hitched. It was my mother's voice. Impossible. She hadn't spoken to me in over 15 years. I backed away, shaking my head. "You're not real," I whispered. The voice softened, pleading. "Please, I'm so sorry. I didn't know they would come for you. I didn't mean to leave you." Tears burned my eyes, a flood of old, forgotten grief crashing down on me. Part of me wanted to believe it was really her, to throw the door open and collapse into her arms like a child. But deep down, I knew better. The shadows beneath the door began to twist and writhe, taking shape. Long, spindly fingers of darkness slid under the crack, stretching toward me. I stumbled back, choking on a scream. The voice turned cold, venomous. "You can't run, Emma. You belong to us." I bolted for the window, yanking it open and climbing onto the ledge just as the door exploded inward, with splintering like brittle bones. Something dark and twisted surged into the room. A thing made of shadows, with hollow, endless eyes that burned with cruel hunger. I didn't think. I jumped. The fall knocked the wind out of me, but adrenaline forced me to my feet. Pain shot through my ankle, but I ignored it and ran, sprinting toward the forest that bordered the estate. The wind roared like a living thing, pushing against me with unnatural force. Branches tore at my face and arms as I stumbled deeper into the woods, breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, moving fast, relentless, hunting. I burst into a clearing lit by the cold, pale light of the moon. In the center stood something that made my blood freeze. A stone altar, ancient and worn, etched with the same symbols from the contract. I understood in that moment. The altar wasn't just a relic of the past. It was the source, the center of the binding. "Emma!" The voice came again, echoing from all directions now. My mother, my father, even my own voice twisted with mocking cruelty. The darkness thickened, coiling like smoke. It was time to end this. Desperate, I grabbed a sharp, jagged piece of stone from the altar's base and held it above the binding mark carved into the altar's surface. If blood was what this thing wanted, my blood, it would have to fight for it. The shadows surged toward me with a horrific scream, and I brought the stone down hard, shattering the ancient mark in a burst of blinding light. The ground shook, the air exploding with raw, furious energy. The darkness howled in agony as the binding unraveled, its power broken at last. The twisted form in the shadows lunged, its claws grazing my arm before it dissolved into ash, scattered by the howling wind. Then, silence. The forest stilled. The altar cracked and crumbled into dust. I fell to my knees, breathless and shaking. Blood dripped from the shallow cut on my arm, just enough to complete the final act. My blood had ended what generations of Callaways had failed to destroy. When I finally made it back to the house, its towering silhouette was dark and lifeless. Whatever force had ruled it was gone. Forever. I left that night. I didn't look back. The inheritance, the money, none of it mattered anymore. I had survived. I was free. But as I walked away, I felt it. A presence, faint but familiar, watching from the shadows of the broken house. Callaway House was dead. But something, some part of it, would always remember. Blood never forgets. Thanks for watching. What would you do if faced with a dark family curse? Share your thoughts in the comments.